Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable and let yourself go. Because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. In one of the most discreet and exclusive neighborhoods in West Boston, where the houses speak in long silences and the gardens look as if they were trimmed with a scalpel, the crime came without a bang. It was discovered on a mild autumn afternoon, when the sun still cast long shadows on the antique glass windows. In the Dalton family mansion, with its Georgian facade and solid walnut doors, chaos did not come screaming in. It settled quietly on the second floor, where important things used to happen behind closed doors. Matthew Dalton, 54, was found dead in his personal study. He was lying face up on a red plaid wool rug, shot clean through the chest. Beside him on the waxed wood rested the old Smith & Wesson revolver that had belonged to his grandfather. The gun was not in his hand. It was close. Too close to be casual. Not close enough to look like part of a suicide. The scene showed no signs of a struggle. No broken objects. No disturbance to the furnishings. The desk was impeccably tidy, with documents organized by type and a fountain pen lined up with a notepad. Next to it, a half-empty glass of red wine, with no visible fingerprints on its outer surface. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no lock violated. Only silence, and the motionless body of a man who, from the arrangement of his hands and the angle of the shot, had not shot himself. The first to find the body was Clementine Brooks, nanny to the Daltons' youngest children. She had gone upstairs to look for Matthew after receiving no response to several calls from the intercom. It was she who contacted the police in a restrained voice, describing the scene as strangely quiet. When Detective Gideon Hartley arrived on the scene, he paused for several minutes at the foot of the staircase before ascending. He observed the portraits hanging on the wall, the perfect symmetry of the hallways, the scent of new varnish. The house was alive but held together with an almost architectural rigidity. Too perfect not to hide something. Hartley went upstairs without haste. When he entered the studio, he knew immediately that what lay before him was not suicide. It was a meticulous act, precise. A crime disguised as normalcy, the wine glass, the order, the carefully placed gun. Everything too clean, everything too contained. The blood had seeped into the carpet slowly. No splatter, no chaos. The shot was single, lethal. The projectile had pierced the heart from the front, at an angle that could only be executed by someone looking directly at the victim. Not from behind, not from a corner, from the front, up close. And in that carpeted silence, Gideon Hartley understood that he was not facing a crime of passion, nor a violent break-in. He was facing an intimate execution, an internal adjustment, a truth that had not yet spoken, but had already left its signature in the precision of the shot. And although no one in the house would say a word, the story that had killed him was already written. All that was left to do was to read it. Matthew Dalton's profile unfolded in the hours after the discovery with the methodical efficiency that characterized his life. He was 43 years old, a corporate lawyer with an impeccable track record, a partner in one of Boston's most influential law firms. He specialized in international mergers, financial compliance, and high-profile corporate litigation. He was the kind of professional whose presence in a room could close a negotiation with a single glance. Respected, neat, accurate, and, according to some, unwavering. But that structured surface began to show cracks as soon as Detective Hartley began to review his immediate surroundings. The facade of success was not as solid as it appeared, and the domestic harmony, that symmetrical order that marked the house from foyer to study, concealed invisible but persistent tensions. He was married to Adelaide Dalton, 41, a former cultural magazine editor who had left her career after the birth of their second child. A devoted mother, a sporadic social figure, she maintained an elegant distance even when speaking of her husband. According to her testimony, Matthew had changed in the last 2 years. He became more reserved, more hermetic. They slept in separate rooms for reasons she declined to specify, and their conversations were more functional than affectionate. At the office, things were not stable either. Several colleagues interviewed by Hartley mentioned that Matthew was in constant arguments with his brother, Charles Dalton, also a partner at the firm. The tension was known, although it was never outwardly expressed publicly. Charles handled administrative matters while Matthew handled the higher-profile clients. but disagreements over strategic decisions had grown in recent weeks. According to some employees, there was already talk of a possible split in the firm, something that could have affected the financial balance and reputation of both. In addition, in the emails on his personal desk, Hartley found an encrypted exchange with an unidentified third party. Messages that spoke in code about the time to do it, about settling the score before it comes due. There were no names. There were no dates. Just a dense sense that something else was brewing in Matthew's life. Something that never materialized. Police also recovered images from external security cameras. None showed forced entry. None captured suspicious movements. But a traffic camera, located 2 blocks away, captured a vehicle stopping briefly in front of the house on the night of the crime. The license plates were partially covered. The driver was unrecognizable. The car did not appear in family records or on the regular visitors database. Inside the house, the key figure was Clementine Brooks, the nanny. She was the one who found the body. She was the one who took care of the children that night. She was the one who said she didn't hear the gunshot. The music was on in the playroom. She said she went upstairs because Matthew wasn't responding to the intercom. He didn't notice anything out of place. He didn't see anyone leave. He heard no footsteps. He only found the door ajar and the now lifeless body on the carpet. There were no foreign footprints at the scene, only Matthew's, Clementine's, and Adelaide's. But to Hartley, the scene said much more than the visible evidence. The order of the desk, the untouched glass, the carefully placed family revolver. This was no rash crime. It was something intimate, something contained, executed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and what he wanted it to look like. There was no chaos, just a carefully orchestrated absence, and as is often the case in houses like that, the truth was not in what was missing. It was in what had been put in too carefully. The first person cited by Detective Gideon Hartley was Adelaide Dalton, wife of the deceased. Not for lack of an alibi nor for direct suspicion. It was procedure, but also an intuitive necessity. In crimes committed in enclosed, orderly spaces, the densest motives often dwell in the intimate. Adelaide was 40 years old. She was a plastic artist with an academic background, with exhibitions in galleries in New York, Chicago, and Boston. In cultural circles, she was known for her minimalist installations and pieces that worked with the tension between emptiness and containment. In her domestic life, she applied the same principle. Her language was sober, her dress precise, her way of moving restrained. Every gesture seemed calculated, as if she knew that any movement too much could ruin the composition. During the interrogation, he presented himself with the same elegance with which he crossed the corridors of the galleries. Long coat, dark glasses, and an expression that was not sadness but discomfort. He answered clearly, without evasiveness but without spontaneity, as if he were narrating a fact that did not entirely belong to him. He said that the marriage had been in a distant but respectful phase for some time, that they shared a house but not intimacy, that they saw each other at formal dinners, at family gatherings, at the children's birthdays. Nothing more. They no longer shared a room, nor projects, nor body. When asked about the night of the crime, Adelaide gave her alibi without hesitation. She had attended a contemporary art exhibition in the downtown cultural district, where she was presenting a collaborative installation. The guest list, images of the event, and testimonials from attendees confirmed her continued presence until after midnight. His alibi was solid and offered no empty spaces. But what it did offer were emotional cracks. When the detective broached the relationship between Matthew and the nanny, Clementine Brooks, Adelaide's gesture tensed for the first time. She did not respond immediately. She arranged her scarf, took a deep breath, and said there was no proof of anything, just intuition. And at that point, her tone changed. He used harsher words. He said Matthew had lost his way, that he was no longer the man she admired, that he'd become evasive, controlling, distant, and that Clementine, young, available, and strangely comfortable in the house, had become his nameless shadow. There was no concrete evidence of a relationship between them. But in Adelaide's personal correspondence, recovered from her laptop, several drafts of unsent letters, written in the second person, were found. In them, she spoke of betrayal, of bodies shared in secret, of the humiliation of smiling at someone sleeping in her bed and thinking of someone else. She never mentioned names. She never signed her name. Hartley then understood that Adelaide had not killed her husband, but she had been displaced emotionally within her own marriage. That displacement did not generate violence. It generated silence, and in that silence, Clara had begun to build her own world, one where Matthew was no longer there. In her final statement, Adelaide said that she did not hold a grudge. That love, when it breaks down, does not always turn into hate. Sometimes it simply becomes another form of loneliness, and that the only thing she regretted was not ending the marriage before death did. She was dismissed as a suspect, not for lack of motive, but for lack of opportunity. But his place in history was clear. He didn't kill Matthew Dalton, but he had already lost him long before anyone shot him. Clementine Brooks was not a central figure in the Dalton story, until she was. She came to the house like so many other young nannies in upscale residential neighborhoods, with good references, impeccable manners, and a face that inspired tranquility. She was 26 years old. She had studied early childhood pedagogy for 2 years before dropping out. She specialized in gentle routines, sensory play, and a style of care that mimicked the voice of absent mothers without taking their place. The children adored her, Adelaide tolerated her, and Matthew, it would later turn out, crossed boundaries with her that were not recorded in work schedules. Clementine was the first to find the body. She went up to the studio after several unanswered calls from the intercom. She said Matthew didn't usually ignore anyone, that something struck her as odd. Her testimony was accurate. He said he didn't touch anything, that she saw him on the floor, that she thought he was sleeping, and then that he wasn't breathing. She called 911 in a restrained voice. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. He just complied. During the interrogation, Detective Gideon Hartley was not looking for a confession. He was looking to read what Clementine's formal language did not say. His tone was leisurely. Her gaze was direct. Every word was carefully chosen. She spoke as if she already knew what she was supposed to say, as if she had rehearsed. What he didn't say, others said. In Matthew's digital diary, Hartley found coded entries that matched times when Clementine was not assigned to childcare. Ambiguous quotes written with initials. Photographs recovered from a mutual friend's phone showed Matthew and Clementine leaving a downtown cafe together, with no children in sight. The images were not compromising, but neither were they innocent. The relationship was real, although never declared. And when Charles Dalton, Matthew's younger brother, returned to Boston after a long absence from work, Clementine shifted her emotional axis. She began spending more time in the garden area when Charles was home. She would leave him handwritten notes. She smiled more than usual. In one of the messages reviewed by police, Charles described her as a calming presence amid the noise. Their relationship, though less well documented, was emotionally intense. When asked about this, Clementine did not deny it. She said she admired Charles, that he was kind, that they talked often, that they understood each other. She didn't elaborate, but her body spoke more than her words. A slight tension in his jaw, a pause every time he had to name one of the brothers. The motive, if there was one, was not hatred. It was emotional ambition, a desire for validation, for belonging, for advancement. Clementine wasn't looking for money. She was looking for position, place, intimate recognition within a house where her existence was simultaneously central and peripheral. And when Matthew began to back away, when it became clear that he would not leave Adelaide, that he would not break his public structure for a nanny with an angelic face and a calculating look, Clementine shifted gears. Charles was more approachable, single, less complex, more willing, and emotionally needy. There was no evidence linking her to the murder, no prints on the gun, no movement out of the expected, no alteration in her routines. Her testimony was consistent, her behavior controlled. But his emotional presence was a cross-cutting crack in the story. She was not formally charged. There were no criminal proceedings. But Hartley watched her leave the police station with the knowledge that her role in the case was not minor. She didn't kill Matthew Dalton, but she was there when it started to fall apart. And while everyone was trying to preserve the facade, she was the only one who learned to navigate the emotional wreckage of the house. Clementine returned to work a few days later, until the family hired an agency to replace her. She didn't say goodbye. She left no letters. Just an empty room, and the faint suspicion that it wasn't her first role, just her most delicate scene. Charles Dalton hadn't been in Boston for years. His life was far away in London, where he ran a small technology firm focused on encryption systems for financial environments. He was brilliant, unassuming, and had always lived in the shadow of his older brother Matthew. He returned to the city just 2 months before the crime. As he explained, for personal reasons, although the family knew that the real reason was more emotional than practical. Charles had no children, he had no steady partner, and his professional life had long since become erratic. The move to Boston was not a planned return, but a reflexive move, to seek belonging in the only place that still recognized his family name. But what he found when he returned was an enclosed structure, a house that didn't need him, a brother who greeted him politely but avoided actual contact, and a nanny, Clementine Brooks, who began to slowly gravitate toward him with a warmth Charles hadn't felt in years. His relationship with her was quick and silent. They did not live together. They did not show each other in public. But the messages between the two revealed an intimate closeness, rife with coded phrases, future plans, and emotional outpourings. Charles spoke of a new beginning, of someone who sees what others ignore. In several notes, Clementine called him my refuge. Everything changed when Charles discovered he wasn't the first. In a message exchange partially deleted from Charles's phone but recovered on the backup of Clementine's device, a conversation appeared in which she admitted to a past relationship with Matthew, without going into detail. Charles did not confront his brother, but by his own testimony, something snapped internally that week. He said he felt humiliated, not just because of the story with Clementine, but because of what it represented. That even in his most vulnerable comeback, Matthew still effortlessly overshadowed him. When he was subpoenaed by Detective Gideon Hartley, Charles arrived nervous, not so much out of legal fear, but because of the emotional imbalance that surrounded him. His first account was confusing. He said he had not been at the house that night, that he had gone for a walk, that he then drove to a dock in the harbor, that he needed air. There were no cameras. There were no witnesses. His alibi was weak. When Hartley insisted, Charles deflected attention. He said Matthew had been in trouble with a business partner, Miles Jennings, linked to a conflict of interest case at the firm. He implied that someone with sufficient reason could have made the crime look domestic, that the precision of the shooting and the staged scene had a professional rather than emotional logic, that not everything should be reduced to jealousy or family drama. The detective listened but did not allow himself to be diverted. The way Charles talked about Matthew said more than the evidence. He described his brother as arrogant, meticulous, cold, but also as someone who had symbolically crushed him since childhood. The one who always shone the brightest. The one the parents preferred. The one who tolerated him more than accepted him. Matthew didn't hate him, but he didn't see it either. And when Clementine became his emotional vanishing point, and that figure was also taken from him, Charles had no tools to sustain the blow. There was no open fury, just pent-up resentment from years. A mixture of humiliation, inferiority, and displacement that coiled like invisible wire around his will. But despite everything, there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. No prints on the gun, no presence captured by cameras, no physical disturbance at the scene. Only a silence that was too dense, a flimsy alibi, and an emotional motive that was not enough to condemn but enough to understand. He was released under supervision. He was not criminally prosecuted. But Detective Hartley knew that if anyone had wanted Matthew dead, not to inherit his money, not his position, but his emotional space in the house, it was Charles Dalton. It did not kill him, but she needed him absent. To be able for once to breathe without a shadow. Miles Jennings was the kind of man whose presence filled a room without raising his voice. A law partner with Matthew Dalton for more than a decade, they shared much more than a name on the firm's facade. They shared a professional history riddled with high-stakes contracts, difficult corporate clients, and ethical decisions that sometimes danced on the edge of legality. He was 40 years old, cautious, analytical, methodical. His reputation in the Boston legal circuit was that of someone with vision and ambition, but also with inflexible boundaries. He was unloved but respected, a name that was spoken with caution, one who knew how to read the game before it began. Her relationship with Matthew had been stable for years, but in recent months, tensions became structural. Hartley discovered this when reviewing archived emails between the two. They weren't hostile messages, but they were cold, loaded with technicalities and phrases that hinted at an impending professional breakup. Matthew was considering selling his share of the firm, according to a series of contract drafts on his desk, as yet unsigned. Matthew's departure implied a restructuring of power, a change in internal dynamics, and more delicately, a possible flight of key clients. When Jennings was summoned by Detective Hartley, he presented himself with the calmness of one who knows the rules of the game. He did not deny the friction, he did not soften the facts. He admitted that the relationship with Matthew had deteriorated, that they were arguing about the direction of the firm, that they no longer shared vision, strategy, or trust. He said that in recent meetings Matthew acted as if he no longer wanted to be there, as if he had made a decision he didn't need to consult. But he also said that did not make him a murderer. And the facts, at least the documented ones, supported it. On the night of the crime, Miles Jennings was at the firm, reviewing a litigation proposal with his paralegal, Helena Torres. Digital records confirmed his activity on the internal system until after midnight. The hall security camera showed him entering at 8:17 p.m. and leaving at 12:36 a.m. There were no interruptions. No movement outside the itinerary was detected. The emails he exchanged with Helena during that time reinforced the narrative. His alibi was solid. What was not so solid was his calm. Hartley noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his watch, the micro-expression of contempt as she uttered the name Matthew. The phrase spoken with an excess of neutrality. He no longer belonged at the firm. Jennings didn't want to kill Dalton, but he did want to see him gone. He wanted what many structures want when a leader begins to crack the base. Replacement, order, silence. What the detective understood without the need for proof was that Jennings would not mourn Matthew's death, not because he hated him, but because his disappearance solved a problem for him that otherwise would have required months of institutional attrition and acrimonious negotiations. In a folder attached to the deposition, Jennings provided a copy of the last purchase offer Matthew had received from a private legal investment fund. The figure was generous, but it implied that, in selling his share, Matthew would take the firm's major clients with him. That left Jennings as a lone figure in a ship too big to pilot alone. When asked by police if he feared for the firm's reputation after his partner's death, Jennings replied that the law doesn't stop for a bullet. That grieving is a luxury not everyone can afford, that the work goes on. He was dismissed as a suspect, not for lack of motive, but because of too much evidence confirming his location. But Hartley wrote his name in indelible ink, not on the list of guilty parties, but on the list of silent beneficiaries, those who do not pull the trigger, but they understand the value of a corpse at the right moment. The truth did not burst out like a roar. It seeped out, as it always does in family crimes, between stilted pauses, shaky chronologies, and looks that didn't quite match the words. Detective Gideon Hartley had not expected a spontaneous confession. He knew that the most intimate crimes were not solved by hard evidence, but by the slow erosion of a poorly sustained emotional structure. For days, Charles Dalton maintained a vague version. He said he went for walks. He spoke of a need to breathe, of nights that helped him think. He offered no details. He did not cite specific places, he did not mention witnesses. Just an emptiness, carefully arranged so as not to be questioned, but which also failed to protect him completely. The fracture came when the digital team accessed his secondary phone backup, synced to a forgotten account in the cloud. There were the deleted messages. They were not confessions, but they were fragments of an emotional state impossible to ignore. In them, Charles spoke of feeling displaced, humiliated, overshadowed. Words loaded with accumulated resentment sent to his brother in the last hours of the day he died. Cryptic but revealing messages. Warnings disguised as introspection. Hartley printed them out. He placed them in front of Charles on a clean table with no accompaniment other than the weight of the words themselves. He asked nothing of him. He just watched his reaction. There was no anger, no denial either. Just a tired look like that of someone who understood that the curtain had fallen. In that gesture, without words, the confession began to take shape. Charles described the evening with emotional accuracy, not coldness. He had gone to the house unannounced. He knew Clementine would be with the children, that Adelaide would not be there, and that Matthew would be in his study, alone, with a glass of wine and the dim lights. Her brother's routine was predictable, almost ceremonial. He didn't have to pick locks. He didn't have to make an excuse. He walked up the stairs with the familiarity of one who always felt invited, though never quite welcome. He entered without knocking. The studio door was ajar. Matthew, surprised but not alarmed, let him pass. The scene was domestic, almost trivial. The wine still steamed faintly in the glass. The papers were neatly arranged. The revolver rested inside the desk drawer as it had always been. a family heirloom rather than a functional weapon. There was no shouting, just a tense, brief conversation, marked by old, unresolved wounds. Charles complained. He accused. He spilled his guts. Matthew responded coolly. He didn't deny the relationship with Clementine. He offered no excuses. The response was dry, condescending, hurtful. Charles did not say it clearly, but it was clear from his account that this was not a physical confrontation, but just another emotional defeat, a final displacement. And then it happened. Charles opened the drawer. He took the revolver with hands that did not tremble. There was no struggle, there was no pleading. Just a suspended instant in which resentment built up over years, over family attention, over professional triumphs, over withheld affection, turned into action. The shot was clean, precise, at close range, straight to the chest. Matthew fell backward soundlessly. Blood began to seep onto the red carpet without disturbing the order around it. The impact did not tip the cup over. It did not dislodge the objects. The scene was frozen as if time itself had been interrupted by the bullet. Charles did not run away immediately. He looked at the body. He moved closer. He opened the frame of the family photograph, which rested on the mantelpiece. He tore it in two. He separated his own image from that of Matthew. He placed the bloody piece next to the corpse. It was not an impromptu gesture. It was a private symbol, a silent signature on an emotional crime, the end of a structure that had never felt her own. Before leaving, he wiped his fingerprints off the gun. He closed the drawer carefully. He didn't turn off the lights. He didn't mess anything up. He went downstairs, left through the back door, and drove aimlessly for almost an hour before returning to his apartment. He didn't sleep that night. At trial, the defense attempted to allege temporal imbalance, but the expert witnesses ruled out unimputability. Charles did not act in a state of alienation. He acted with emotional clarity, albeit overwhelmed by rage and frustration. His full confession, together with the digital evidence and the forensic elements, sealed the case beyond doubt. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Clementine Brooks was not charged with complicity. There was no evidence linking her directly to the crime, but her emotional role was undeniable. She had occupied an overly sensitive place between the two brothers, as a catalyst, as a mirror, as a vector of a wound that was already there long before her arrival. Gideon Hartley closed the file with a brief note, written in the margin of his final report. It read, "He did not kill for love. He killed for the space that was not granted to him, and he reclaimed it the only way he knew how, by leaving silence where once there was shadow." Case 2. At 6:14 a.m., a group of teenage hikers turned off the main trail, following a narrow stretch along the river on the southwest outskirts of Chicago. Day was barely breaking through the thick fog, and the ground was covered with mud, fallen branches, and decaying leaves. That's when they saw it. A motionless, misshapen lump half-submerged on the bank, enveloped in dark mud and surrounded by a thick halo of chemical stench. The emergency call was brief, almost unintelligible because of the trembling voice of the person holding the phone. When the first patrol team arrived, the area was already disturbed. 3 young women were crying, sitting on a wet rock, covered with thermal blankets. The group instructor was vomiting a few feet away from the body. The scene was grotesque. The corpse was partially buried in a mixture of silt and organic debris. The torso protruded with an unnatural curvature, as if it had been thrown from a certain height and then washed downstream. The skin was swollen, torn in places. There were greenish spots and bubbles of trapped gases. The hands had no fingertips. The nails were detached. The face, deformed by decomposition, seemed to simulate an expression of anguish or suffocation. The smell was not just rot. There was something else. Something sulfuric, pungent, chemical. One of the technicians thought of spilled fuel. Another thought of contaminated water. None of them said it out loud. Detective Silas Marin arrived at 7:03 a.m. He was alone, as usual. He walked slowly along the edge of the perimeter, hands in his coat pockets. Tall, with a face always half-shaven and a neutral gesture that made him seem absent even when he was paying attention. He didn't ask questions right away. He just crouched down beside the body, looked at the angle of the neck, the remnants of what had once been eyelids and the cracked sludge over the chest cavity. He breathed through his mouth. Then he sat up. It was his 23rd body found outdoors in the last 12 years. But this one had something different. a strangeness that could not be explained by the surroundings alone. It was the posture, the accelerated deterioration, the arrangement of the mud around the skull, and above all, the absence of external traces. There was no obvious dragging. There were no footprints in the immediate area, as if the body had appeared alone. Hours later, in the laboratory, forensic examiners detected active gangrene in the nostrils and dead tissue in areas where there should still be vital signs at the time of death. The skull had multiple depressions, but none with exposed fractures. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of organic compounds similar to poultry droppings, along with a parasite specific to the respiratory tract of poultry, lodged in the victim's neck. Silas Marin did not believe in symbolism, but he took note of the parasite. He took note of the smell and the absent fingers. He didn't rule anything out. He had learned not to. As evening fell, the news crossed social networks and local media. At a fast food restaurant near the site of the discovery, a customer had found what appeared to be a human finger inside a box of chicken nuggets. Forensic analysis confirmed the genetic correspondence with the body found in the river. They were his, cleanly cut with a high-pressure tool, typical of industrial meat processing environments. The scene was beginning to mutate. What looked like a crime hidden under mud and decomposition was taking the shape of something more complex, more symbolic, more disturbing. And Silas Marin knew, from experience, that the more absurd a death seemed, the more humane its cause was. The identification of the body took less than 24 hours. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, a small dental tag with a serial number confirmed his identity. It was Nicholas Geller, age 38, a resident of suburban Plainfield, Illinois, a well-known figure, at least in certain circles. Silas Marin reviewed the digital file that afternoon. The full name was linked to Cluxton Farms, one of the state's largest poultry plants. Nick Geller had held the position of chief of staff for 6 years, although his first appearances in public records were much earlier. In his youth, he had been an animal rights activist. He attended marches, organized protests in front of slaughterhouses, and signed articles in independent blogs under the pseudonym Featherfire. It was precisely this past that was most striking. What he once fought against with conviction was now his way of life. Eventually, Nick left the militancy and joined the family business. The plant belonged to his father-in-law, a retired businessman who had placed him as an intermediary between management and operating personnel. In theory, he was supposed to facilitate labor relations. In practice, he became a gray authority figure, distant, controlling. Cluxton Farms' internal reports were not public, but an anonymous source provided Marin with copies of several employee complaints. Among them was one that struck a personal note. An operator named Gina had formally accused him of verbal harassment and demeaning treatment. The complaint had not gone to court. It was resolved internally with no visible sanction. At home, things didn't seem stable either. He was married to Gaynor Geller, a low-profile occupational therapist with little social presence. The couple had no children. According to financial records, they shared property, but had been living in separate rooms for almost a year. There were records of calls to marriage counseling services and individual consultations by her. No police reports. No outside intervention. The most recent item in his file was a business transition document. Nicholas Geller was about to assume full management of Cluxton Farms as part of a management reorganization. His promotion was imminent, and with it, so were internal tensions, historical feuds, and exposure. Marin took note of everything. There was nothing to link him to a violent death yet, but there were enough open lines to keep pulling at the thread. Too many to ignore. The first to be formally summoned was the wife. 41-year-old Gaynor Geller came to the police department without escort or pressure. She showed up of her own free will, just hours after the media confirmed the identity of the body found in the river. Her attitude was correct but distant. She did not ask for a lawyer. She did not demand privacy. She sat, waited, responded. She was a well-known, if discreet, figure in certain environmental circles in Chicago. She had worked for years as a freelance graphic designer until, little by little, her professional activity began to be diluted in her militancy. She participated in community talks, workshops on sustainability, and local campaigns against food overproduction. She had never been the face of any movement, but her presence was constant, silent, persistent. The history with her husband, Nicholas Geller, was far more complex than legal documents could describe. The distance between them was not measured in yards, but in belief systems. Nick had been an activist in his college years, and it was that, Gaynor said, that attracted her to him at first. His ability to question, his critical eye toward the industry. But something changed. The family debts, the corporate structure, the money at stake. Nick went from protest to management, from placards to quarterly balance sheets. She didn't follow him down that path. She never accepted it. During questioning, Gaynor surrendered his cell phone voluntarily. She allowed full access to her messages, locations, and multimedia content. She did not seem concerned about hiding anything. In fact, it was she who volunteered almost immediately the footage taken inside the poultry plant. Raw images, recorded with a handheld camera hidden in her coat, during a visit she made with her husband 2 weeks before the crime. The scenes showed rusting machinery, dying animals, employees without adequate protection. The conditions were brutal. When asked why she recorded this, her answer was simple. She wanted Nick to see what she saw. Not from the air conditioning in her office, not from a technical report, but from the inside. She wanted to make him understand what the place where she worked meant. She said she never planned to report him publicly. It was not a legal issue. It was emotional. Security cameras and location records confirmed that on the day of the murder, Gaynor was at an ecological community center in Oak Park, more than 30 kilometers from where the body was found. He did not move from there for hours. The alibi was solid. No one could place her at or near the scene. What struck Detective Marin was not his coolness, but his poise. There were no tears, but no evasions either. He responded with precision, without over-explanation, without drama. His way of relating the deterioration of the marriage was not aggressive, not defensive. It was factual. They slept in separate rooms. They hardly spoke. They exchanged emails to coordinate logistical matters. They did not share projects. They had no children. Rather than a grieving wife, Gaynor presented herself as someone who had already lost her husband long before his physical death. What remained between them was barely a functional reflection of a union that had ceased to exist. But that did not erase the moral burden. What did seem to weigh on her, and it showed in the silences between each answer, was something else. The fact that her husband had died wrapped in the same symbols she fought so hard against. Mud, machinery, decay, waste. A death without dignity. A brutal metaphor for what he had ended up being. For Marin, there was no reason to hold her back. There were tensions, yes, but there was no hatred. There was no planning. There was disappointment, brokenness, a form of love frayed by ideological differences, but nothing to suggest complicity or homicidal intent. She was let go without charge, collaborative, serene, absent, as if the guilt she carried was already being served in an invisible cell. The next point in the investigation took Detective Silas Marin to the Cluxton Farms headquarters. Security at the site had been tightened following the leak of the footage taken by Gaynor Geller, and the appearance of Nicholas Geller's body had only worsened the overall climate. Protesters crowded the entrance with signs, megaphones, and anger amplified by public suspicion. At the back of the perimeter, isolated from the shouting, stood John Dawes, head of security. A hard-eyed veteran, Dawes had accumulated more than 20 years in private security services, many of them in industrial plants. He was known for his aggressive attitude, disciplinarian approach, and thinly veiled contempt for the activists who surrounded the plant with increasing frequency. His record showed several physical interventions and demonstrations, although none had ended in criminal charges. He maintained his authority through fear and control. He was respected by his team, tolerated by management. The detective summoned him to the same room where Gaynor had been questioned days earlier. Dawes arrived with his right arm immobilized by a rigid splint. He said he had recently had it fitted, the result of a minor fracture. When asked what had caused it, he replied that it was the result of an altercation with a protester who had thrown paint at the perimeter fence. He did not file a complaint. He did not go to the hospital on the day of the incident. He only showed the subsequent medical report, issued by a private clinic with no external witnesses. During the interrogation, his tone was dry. He answered bluntly without nuance. He referred to activists as agitators or mobs. He said that if anyone hated Nicholas Geller, it wasn't inside the plant, it was outside. He said it with conviction, almost pride. To him, Geller had been a constant target not because of his business decisions, but because of what he stood for. A traitor to his own cause. An exactivist turned power figure. When asked about his relationship with Geller, the answer was evasive. He said that he was following orders. He was neither his friend nor his enemy. that his job was to keep the plant running without interruptions, no noise, no scandals, no cameras. But something else was seeping into his body language. He tensed his jaw when he heard the victim's name. He moved his leg insistently under the table. He avoided staring at the documents in front of him. The detective also noticed a minor but significant detail. In one of the access reports, John Dawes was listed in the system as being present on the floor outside his usual hours, just the night before the body was found. He said he had come in on a false alarm, something he said happened frequently. He did not sign the log. It was not recorded by internal cameras due to an alleged failure in the monitoring system. A functional but weak explanation. Nor did the nature of the injury to his hand escape the forensic report. The fracture pattern was consistent with direct impact on a hard surface, possibly during a physical altercation. Although there was no blood under her fingernails or signs of violence on her clothing, suspicion remained. Dawes was released at the end of the interview, but the detective requested unofficial monitoring of his movements. It wasn't just what he said, it was because of how he said it, because of the rage he didn't hide, and for that poorly explained fracture which placed him, at least symbolically, at the center of a fight that still had no name. He was subpoenaed on the third day of the investigation. Josh Rollins, visible leader of the Radical Poultry Justice Collective, had already appeared in previous reports. His name appeared in at least a dozen police interventions for disturbances in front of processing plants, including Cluxton Farms. He had never been formally accused of direct violence, but his combative discourse, defiant style, and ability to mobilize demonstrators had made him an uncomfortable figure for the local meat industry. He was 32 years old, charismatic, extroverted, with a history of constant activism since the age of 18. He documented everything: protests, speeches, live operations, and reflections in front of the camera. His visual aesthetic and confrontational narrative had made him a media figure, both admired and rejected. When he was subpoenaed by Detective Silas Marin, he was not surprised. He knew his name would come up sooner or later. He showed up with his cell phone in hand with a firm but cooperative attitude. He did not ask for legal representation, nor did he make any prior statements. He simply handed over his devices, backups, and geolocation locations without objection. During cross-examination, his tone was not defensive, but convinced. He said that Nicholas Geller's death was a tragedy, but not out of sympathy for the victim, but because of the message that was being built around his figure. He claimed that he was considered a traitor within the movement, someone who had used his youth activism as a platform to legitimize himself within the system he now led. Nick represented everything Rollins was fighting against: the conversion of idealism into machinery, the move from dissent to management. For him, his promotion at Cluxton Farms was an ethical affront. In one of his most recent speeches, he had said that the plant was a factory of suffering cloaked in efficiency. Comments like that were used by investigators as a possible indication of incitement or prior conflict. Rollins did not deny them. He restated every sentence. He explained that the repression against activists, especially during the latest demonstrations, had been brutal, that they had been sprayed with irritant chemicals, pushed off the property with violence, and that several of their comrades had been arrested without clear cause. He claimed that Nick Geller was part of that system of repression. However, the evidence completely excluded him as the perpetrator of the crime. On the day of the murder, Rollins posted a live video stream during an awareness day outside a restaurant in Evanston. The original footage, uncut and unedited, showed his continuous presence from 10 a.m. until late at night. Geller's exact estimated time of death, still uncertain but in a clear afternoon time frame, coincided with his public exposure. Several witnesses verified his presence at the scene. His participation in a live radio interview that same day was even confirmed. Authorities found no evidence of movement from his location to the area where the body was found. Traffic cameras, toll records, and digital mobility analysis reinforced his alibi. Rollins was nowhere near. He had no physical opportunity, and there was no evidence to suggest indirect complicity. Marin watched the activist cautiously. He knew that, although ruled out as a direct suspect, his figure was still important, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was a reflection of constant pressure, a hostile environment, a pent-up anger that had surrounded the victim long before his death. Rollins left the room without a gesture of relief. He did not say thank you. He did not apologize. He only said that the real violence was not on the street, but in the production chain. and that sooner or later that truth finds its way to the surface. The last name on the list of suspects did not come from inside the plant, nor from activist circles. It came from the invisible periphery of the conflict. Roy Myers, an artisan baker, owns a small bakery located just 400 meters from the rear boundary of Cluxton Farms, a traditional bakery, inherited from his father, with a wood-fired oven and natural fermentation. A business in decline, to which the neighboring plant had stolen the air. The constant stench, especially on hot days or shift changes, had scared off the clientele. Complaints were frequent. Negative comments on social media were increasing. Roy said that the smell got into the bread, that the yeast no longer breathed as it used to, that customers didn't want to come in. He said it without metaphor. He meant it literally. Silas Marin subpoenaed him after receiving an anonymous tip. According to the report, Roy had expressed veiled threats toward plant employees. On cross-examination, his posture was rigid. He did not deny his anger, but framed it as legitimate protest. He said he had sent letters, formal requests, even a neighborhood petition with more than 30 signatures. That Nicholas Geller never responded, that he consciously ignored it, that he screwed up by omission. But the economic motive was not the only thing he carried. During the interrogation, a new element emerged, more personal, more tense. Allison Myers, his 19-year-old daughter, had worked at the plant for a year. She wasn't just any assistant. She operated cutting machinery on the production line, a position that required precision, mechanical routine, and direct contact with the rawest processes in the system. Roy argued that Geller had crossed boundaries, ambiguous comments, inappropriate questions, unnecessary physical contact. He said Allison had asked for a change of area on 2 occasions with no response, that he went home more than once without speaking, that he dropped in performance, that she changed. There was no formal complaint. But for him, the lack of action was proof enough. During the process, tools were confiscated from his premises: bread knives, metal hooks, even a cigar cutter adapted for marking fermented dough. But none of them matched the damage found on Geller's body, nor the cuts, nor the marks, nor the impact pattern. His alibi was validated by 3 witnesses: 2 frequent customers and a supplier who shared space with him during the entire afternoon in which the crime is estimated to have occurred. In addition, cameras from a nearby supermarket showed him entering and leaving on several occasions throughout the day. There was no movement, no empty windows of time. Detective Marin did not see in Roy a guilty man, but a defeated man. One who had lost more than income. One who lived with a daughter exposed to an environment he could not control. His anger was genuine, his helplessness palpable. But his place in the case was more symbolic than real. He represented the indirect consequences, the collateral injuries, the victims who never make the headlines. He was released. He asked no questions, he did not apologize. He just walked out with his hands empty, his face to the ground, and an anger that, though legitimate, he had no one to charge anymore. It was not cited in the first place. She did not initially appear in the records of interest. She only appeared on Detective Marin's radar after her father's interrogation. When Roy Myers mentioned the mood swings, the prolonged silences, and the failed attempts at area relocation, Allison Myers' name began to take on a different weight. She wasn't just an employee. She was a piece of the victim's immediate environment, someone who had lived with him among production lines, metal noise, and moving cages. Allison was 19 years old. She had started working at Cluxton Farms out of necessity. She had left technical school incomplete. Her resume was brief, her reality much more complex. She was assigned to the automated cutting section, a critical area of the industrial process. She operated the machinery used for the butchering process, a device that held the head of the chickens and cut off part of the beak with thermal precision. The work was mechanical, constant, and above all isolated. Little contact, little supervision, a lot of wear and tear. During the first months, according to internal records, his performance was high. There were no complaints, but everything changed after she filed a formal sexual harassment complaint against Nicholas Geller. The document was brief. It contained no visual evidence or recordings, just her testimony. It said Nick approached her for no reason, talked too close, and made ambiguous comments about her appearance. It said he once tried to touch her arm when she was adjusting the machine's temperature sensor. She said she felt afraid. The complaint did not move forward. It was filed as subjective perception of misconduct. Within days, Allison was reassigned to secondary duties. She remained at the plant, but with less visibility, less turnover, less contact with other operators, more loneliness. During the interrogation, he presented himself with a rigid body, shoulders forward, hands clasped in his lap. He did not deny his hatred. She pronounced it in clear words, though without raising her voice. She said she had wished he would go away, that he would leave the plant, that she wished he would break his face on a poorly calibrated machine. She said it without pause, without apology, like someone who has nothing left to lose. When Marin asked him if he had intended to harm her, he did not answer immediately. He looked down at the ground. He took a slow breath. Then he said yes, that he thought about it, that he imagined it many times, that he fantasized about getting revenge, but that he never did. The evidence supported it. Her shift on the day of the crime did not coincide with the estimated time of death. Plant security cameras showed her in her section throughout the day, with a limited commuting route. She did not leave her station. She did not leave the building. She had no physical contact with the victim that day. No biological remains of his were found on the victim's clothing. No fingerprints, no blood, no genetic material. The machinery she was operating was completely checked. There were no alterations or signs of tampering. There was no material link between her and the crime. Even so, his testimony was recorded with emphasis, not for what he said, but because of how he said it. His words were not a confession, they were a plea. The plea of someone who had reached the limit, who had thought about it, yes, who had wished for it, but who still chose not to do it. Silas Marin did not see in her a killer. He saw a victim trapped in a structure that protected her predators. He saw pent-up rage, voiceless shame, and a helplessness that didn't need jail, because it already lived inside another. He let her go, but he did not forget her. With all the elements on the table, Detective Silas Marin did not need a sudden revelation. He understood it as a silent fitting together of pieces that, separately, said nothing. But together they assembled a truth without a margin. The physical evidence, the psychological profile, the narrative fractures, and the accumulation of tensions all pointed sharply to John Dawes, head of security at Cluxton Farms. The history of conflict between Dawes and Nicholas Geller was not new. Several witnesses, including middle supervisors, reported intense verbal confrontations over the past year. There was talk of shouting in hallways, shoving in the loading dock, threats contained behind technical language. One of the most recent arguments had been sparked by the company's misuse of gasoline. Dawes was accused of diverting resources, of using security vehicles for personal purposes, and Nick Geller had confronted him directly. According to internal records, there was a written warning, an informal sanction, and silence. But the silence did not close the wound. It only displaced it. During his first interrogation, Dawes presented with a fractured right hand, attributed to a minor altercation with protesters. No police report, no witnesses, only a medical report issued by a private clinic. The fracture, however, drew attention because of its angular pattern, unusual in closed-fist confrontations. Further analysis of the X-ray report revealed a backward twisting, more compatible with an attempt to lift dead weight or free a stuck object. Not a clean hit. The most telling piece of information came when Marin ordered a technical inspection of the plucking machine in the central area of the plant. An automated industrial device used to remove the bird's feathers after the initial thermal process. The machine had unidentified dry residue between the blades. A forensic cleaning with specialized reagents found traces of human blood, synthetic fabric fibers, and fragments of a gray necktie, the same model Geller had worn on the day of his disappearance. In parallel, medical experts analyzing the body found in the river found an irregular skull fracture pattern with multiple impacts that did not correspond to a linear object. The curvature of the blows suggested that the victim had been pushed against a rotating cutting surface. The necktie had acted as a momentary barrier, deflecting the blades and generating a rebound effect that altered the geometry of the trauma. It was not a premeditated murder. It was a violent outburst in the midst of an argument. With this data, Marin requested a physical reconstruction using an articulated dummy, red paint, and a simulated rotational system. Replicating the scene inside an enclosed plant resulted in a spatter and residue pattern identical to that found on Dawes's underwear, which had never been sent for cleaning. On its underside, human skin fibers and a drop of dried blood were detected adhering to the inner seam. The second interrogation did not last long. Dawes arrived with the same tense gesture, but without the previous firmness. When presented with the evidence, he denied nothing. He offered no resistance. He only lowered his head and accepted the sequence with a coolness that was not remorse, but defeat. He confessed that on the day of the crime, Geller had confronted him in the maintenance room. The argument escalated. Insults crossed the line. In a moment of rage, he pushed him against the plucking machine, which was in manual mode, with no shutdown protocol activated. The tie became entangled first. Geller tried to free himself, but slipped. The rest was immediate, violent, irreversible. Dawes broke his hand trying to remove the body from between the rollers. He was unsuccessful. He panicked. He shut down the system, cleared the visible, and hauled the body down the secondary ramp to a tailgate. He loaded it into one of the empty cargo trucks. He wrapped it in a plastic tarp, strapped it down with shipping straps, and drove to a remote spot on the river. There, without planning, he threw the body from a low slope. He thought the current would sweep it away. It didn't. The mud caught him a few meters away. On his way back, he made an additional mistake. He forgot that part of the severed fingers had been left in the de-piecing machine, where Allison Myers had taken a shift earlier that night. Unbeknownst to him, the machine processed human remains along with the usual routine. Hours later, the fingers turned up in a box of nuggets, and the case took an unexpected turn. The crime, although accidental in its trigger, was concealed with full awareness. And with that, it went from being an impulsive act to a murder aggravated by tampering with evidence and illegal disposal of the body. The trial was brief. John Dawes was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He never apologized. He never sought to justify his conduct. He said only that he couldn't stand a man like Geller having power, that he had hated him for years, that the smell of the plant wouldn't go away even with soap, that the blood wouldn't come out of the uniforms. Nicholas Geller died trapped in the bowels of the very system he had run. His body was crushed, mutilated, and discarded as just another waste product of the process. A death that replicated, with symbolic accuracy, the fate of the animals he once claimed to want to protect. And Silas Marin, in closing the case, only wrote down one sentence in his notebook. The machine doesn't choose who it shreds. It only does so when someone leaves it on. Case 3. The call came in at 4:17 in the morning. In a neighborhood filled with powdered luxuries and mansions that had known better decades, the rumble sounded like a restrained roar, followed by a dry, almost unnatural vibration. The glow that briefly tinted the sky over the Austin Hills caused some residents to get out of bed with an altered pulse. Others simply returned to their slumber, convinced it was one of many impromptu remodels that plagued the neighborhood. But it was no accident. It wasn't a gas failure. It was something much more calculated, more intimate. When Detective Ephraim Delaney arrived on the scene, the air smelled of burnt rust, of rotting wood, of recent death. He stopped at the bottom of the hill where the flashing lights of patrol cars and fire trucks painted the early morning with flashes of blue and red. The Hartley mansion, once a symbol of Texan ostentation, now looked like a dying creature. Chest open, ribs exposed, and a black smoking wound throbbing in its center. Ephraim was 58 years old. He had spent 30 of them walking among emotional wrecks disguised as perfect homes. He had learned that the worst crimes rarely occurred in dark alleys. They were quiet, domestic, often wrapped in wrapping paper. Born in Baton Rouge, raised by a father who faded between factory shifts and a mother obsessed with cleanliness as a method of control, Delaney had been forged in the midst of emotional turmoil. He never married. She never had children. Her world was observation, the study of human crevices. Pain she understood. He respected it. He did not fear it. He listened to it as one who listens to an ancient language, one that he could read in every scene, in every forced silence, in every corpse. The body was found in what was once the main hall. It was charred almost to the point of disintegration. Only the remains of the skull and part of the torso were left, enough to confirm that it was a man. Everything else was dense, fragmented ash. All around, the furniture was in shreds, the beams collapsed, and the exterior walls showed signs of having received the shock wave from within, as if the house had exhaled its last breath in rage. The natural gas valve was fully open. There were no signs of technical failure. There were no accidental cuts in the pipes. It was a decision. Someone had turned that valve with full intent. Delaney looked at the water heater, its surface showing layers of soot as if someone had been cooking smoke inside. Yet its components were intact, almost flawless. That contradiction was no accident. It was control, technique, sabotage. Forensics also extracted scattered evidence from the debris. A partially burned set of pliers, a power cord corroded by fire, small glass fragments belonging to a canning jar, possibly used to contain some volatile chemical, and a deformed metal disc with yellowish residue suggesting the presence of highly combustible substances. This was no domestic accident. It was a rudimentary device, but a deadly effective one. The explosion had not been designed to wipe out everything. It had been precise enough to focus the destruction on a specific area of the house. Everything pointed to a message, an intimate, personal one, as if the killer didn't want to erase the past, but to show it, as if death was just part of the show. Delaney crossed the blackened anteroom with slow steps. Inside her, something told her that this story was not new, that the ghosts in that mansion had been screaming long before the explosion. Only no one had heard them until now. Hours after the discovery, coroners confirmed that the charred body belonged to Don Hartley, 52, a retired businessman and former real estate investor, married for 23 years to Paula Hartley, who was not at the property at the time. Confirmation was made through dental records. His metal watch, found near the body, also matched the model and serial number purchased by Hartley 10 years ago. There was no doubt. The owner of the mansion was the victim. Detective Ephraim Delaney immediately requested Hartley's medical and financial records. What emerged from those documents drew a complex profile. During the pandemic, Don Hartley had lost almost his entire fortune. Several of his real estate projects were stalled or foreclosed upon. His name, once frequently featured in local business magazines, disappeared from public life. In the last 3 years, he had begun to live in partial seclusion. He did not go out to social events. He maintained the mansion, but with a reduced maintenance crew. The economic decline was accompanied by emotional deterioration. Hartley was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. He also became dependent on phenobarbital, a controlled-use sedative. His medical records indicated repeated prescriptions, and psychiatric follow-up discontinued more than 6 months earlier. The debts were numerous, credit cards maxed out, unpaid mortgages on undeveloped land, unpaid medical bills. One of the most particular debts caught Delaney's attention, an informal loan for $20,000 from Carla Mendoza, Hartley's former personal assistant and business protege. The transaction did not appear in banks or official records. It was only found thanks to an email retrieved from the cloud. The tone of the message was cold and direct. Mendoza demanded payment within a maximum of 2 weeks. The email had been sent 3 days before the explosion. In parallel, it was confirmed that the gas valve found open had no mechanical damage. It was turned manually. The pressure buildup and gas concentration in the main room indicate that the process was deliberate and sustained. There were no technical failures. The metal disc with yellow residue was sent to a specialized laboratory. The preliminary report indicated the presence of epoxy resin, aluminum powder, and traces of industrial oxidizer, possibly used to construct a homemade explosive charge. The glass jars reinforced this hypothesis. Everything seemed to indicate that someone assembled the device directly on the property, using accessible but dangerous materials. The investigators began to work with 2 main hypotheses: premeditated suicide or homicide disguised as a domestic accident. But there were details that did not fit with the idea of suicide. The level of planning, the use of an explosive device, and the time of detonation, just before dawn, were not typical of an impulsive or desperate act. In addition, no traces of phenobarbital were found in the area of the body, nor a letter or final message. Delaney didn't rule anything out, but his experience told him that someone wanted it to look like an accident, that it was a carefully staged scene, and that the motive, whether financial, emotional, or personal, was closer than it seemed. The next step was clear. Identify all persons with access to the house. Check bank movements, recent phone calls, presence on the property, and any traces of conflict in the days prior to the explosion. The pattern of destruction suggested closeness, and the killer, if there was one, knew the place well. Delaney requested access to visitor logs, remodeling contracts, and neighborhood surveillance cameras. He also demanded a complete list of family members, workers, creditors, and former partners. No one would be left out. In less than 24 hours, a list was drawn up of the 5 names that, because of their ties, opportunities, or previous conflicts with Don Hartley, became the prime suspects. On the 3rd day of investigation, the data analysis team leaked an anomalous pattern in Don Hartley's call records. A single line, registered under the name Carla Mendoza, was listed with 23 contact attempts in the 48 hours prior to the estimated time of the explosion. Some attempts were within minutes of each other. Several went unanswered. 3 included voice messages lasting more than 30 seconds. Investigators requested access to audio backups, and one of the recordings, sent shortly after 3 a.m., generated an immediate internal alert. Carla's voice sounded strained, irritated. The words were vague, but the emotional charge was clear. She said she was not going to tolerate any more excuses, that she expected an answer before dawn. He mentioned having been there and knowing every nook and cranny of that house. It wasn't an explicit threat, but it wasn't a simple complaint either. The message was sent just over an hour before the explosion. That same day, she was summoned to the police department. She arrived in silence. No lawyer. She wore athletic clothes and held her phone tightly, as if it were an extension of her control. Detective Delaney watched her for several minutes before speaking. He noticed that her movements were calculated, but there was stiffness in her breathing, a tension not entirely suppressed. The session began with basic questions. Routine, confirm identity, connection to the Hartleys, reason for her relationship with the family. Carla responded without hesitation. She said she had met Paula through a mentoring program for women entrepreneurs, and had later collaborated with Don on an investment proposal for wellness retreat centers. The project, she explained, had been canceled for logistical reasons and due to differences in criteria. When asked about the debt, he did not hesitate. He claimed that Don owed him exactly $20,000, corresponding to his initial investment. He claimed to have pressured him for weeks to pay him, but denied threatening him. He said he had gone to the house the night before just to talk and left before midnight. His version was compared with images from neighborhood security cameras. A vehicle with license plates in his name was seen driving up the street leading to the Hartley mansion at 22:11 p.m. and driving down again at 0:38 a.m. That difference of more than 2 hours contradicted his initial statement. Still, he insisted that he did not enter the house, that he stayed waiting in his car and then left. But the vehicle's GPS data indicated that the car was stopped for a period of 35 minutes in front of the main entrance. It then moved to the rear of the property, where the old carport was located. That area was not under direct surveillance by the street cameras. The GPS marked the vehicle stationary there from 23:03 to 0:06. At 00:38, the car left the area. When shown this data, Carla folded her arms. She didn't deny it. She said she wanted to talk to Don face-to-face, but he wouldn't open up to her. She stated that she expected him to come down, but he never did. According to her, she felt ignored and decided to leave. Delaney did not interrupt it. He just wrote it down. Then he placed the victim's toxicology report on the table. There were no traces of phenobarbital in the body. That ruled out the possibility that Don had been sedated at the time of the explosion. He was conscious. Someone who knew him well would know that he didn't sleep well without pharmacological help. Someone like Carla. She kept her eyes on the report. She did not read it. She just watched it out of the corner of her eye. Her pupils did not move. She didn't ask what it meant. Investigators knew that Carla had called multiple times, that she had been in the house for a critical period of time, and that she had lied about her location. But there was still no physical evidence linking her to the handling of the explosive device. The remains of the device contained no fingerprints. The wiring was mostly melted. Only a metal fragment with yellowish residue had been salvaged and was being analyzed by an outside laboratory. Carla changed her position several times during the interrogation. She avoided talking about Paula Hartley unless asked directly. When the argument that occurred weeks earlier was mentioned to her, she acknowledged insulting her, but downplayed the incident. She said she was frustrated, that she couldn't stand to see Don break down in front of a woman who, according to her, controlled him emotionally. Her body language stiffened as she talked about Don's personal life. She said he was no longer the man she had admired, that he had lost initiative, clarity, drive. She described him as dull, absent, dragging his depression through the halls of an increasingly empty house. That perception was key. Carla was not only financially motivated, she had a deep, possibly personal disappointment, a mixture of frustration and resentment that took her away from a purely financial rationale. At the end of the session, Delaney asked for a complete review of the neighborhood cameras, not only on the street but also in the adjoining houses. He needed to confirm whether Carla had had any physical contact with the house during her visit. She also ordered an analysis of her hands and clothing for chemical residue, although she knew that after so many hours the odds were low. For now, Carla was free, but she was not clean. She had motive, she had a presence at the scene, and she had lied. Delaney watched her as she walked away. He didn't look back. He just walked out of the building with the same measured calm with which he had entered. No emotion, no trembling, just an uncomfortable coldness that was not indifference but calculation. In visual activity, logs from the gym located less than 15 minutes from the Hartley mansion, security cameras captured Paula Hartley arriving at 2:01 a.m. on the day of the explosion. She got out of her vehicle wearing athletic attire but did not immediately enter. She remained in the parking lot for about half an hour, conversing with a man later identified as Josh Mendez, the prime contractor in charge of the remodeling at her home. The conversation was close. At least 2 moments the images showed prolonged physical contact and kissing, taken by the facility's rear camera, located at a blind angle from the inside. The images did not confirm physical activity related to training. Paula never accessed the gym facility that night. After that conversation with Josh, she left the premises at 2:35 a.m. in an unknown direction. An hour and 40 minutes later, her husband, Don Hartley, was killed in an explosion inside their home. Paula's first impression was that of a woman who had been nursing an image she no longer believed to be real. Her posture was impeccable. Her voice was low, controlled, but her hands moved with a constant restlessness. When she was called in for questioning, her answers were slow, as if she weighed every word. Investigators observed that she answered questions without looking them in the eye. She kept her eyes fixed on the folder on the table, even when the conversation was no longer focused on papers. She had been a model during her youth, and after marrying Don Hartley, her public life had been reduced to the family sphere. In recent years, she had resumed her interest in interior design, working as a freelance decorator on small projects. Remodeling her own home was her main project at the time of the crime. Josh Mendez, the contractor involved, had been hired by her directly. There were bank records showing payments issued from her personal account to Josh's company over the past 8 months. On cross-examination, she denied any romantic relationship with him. She said he was a good professional and that talking to him offered her an emotional outlet, but that there was no personal relationship. However, the cameras showed otherwise, and more than that, they showed the kind of intimacy that is not easily faked. Her marriage to Don Hartley had been deteriorating for years. There was no documented physical violence, but the testimony of a maid, collected during the investigation, described frequent episodes of tension, muffled screams in closed hallways, and long silences between the two that often lasted for days. Paula never reported abuse, but previous couples' counseling sessions, accessed by investigators through court order, contained descriptions of emotional manipulation, isolation, and financial control by Don. She spoke of feeling trapped, of losing her voice, of no longer recognizing herself. All of this took on weight when a new element was added: the existence of a life insurance policy in Don Hartley's name, with Paula as the sole beneficiary, estimated at $500,000. The policy had been renewed the previous year, during a period when Don was already showing advanced signs of depression. The signature on the contract matched his own, although on the attached medical note, Don was listed as a stable, on-medication patient. The motive was present. The economic motive was intertwined with an emotional need accumulated over the years. The idea of freeing oneself from a broken, ruined, and emotionally dependent man might sound extreme from the outside. But the documents, therapeutic history, and audio-visual records were beginning to map out a narrative that was hard to ignore. During the interrogation, her behavior became erratic at times. Paula would correct her answers mid-sentence. She contradicted previous versions given by herself. She denied having been in contact with Don the previous day, but then admitted to sending him a short voice message, asking if he would sign cancellation papers for a shared account. The message contained no hostility, but the timings coincided with her leaving the gym, just an hour and a half before the explosion. His vehicle was inspected. No chemical residue or suspicious material was found. There was no physical evidence directly linking her to the handling of the gas or explosive device, but the timing, emotional closeness, and sudden change in her behavior after Don's death raised doubts. After the incident, Paula showed no visible emotional response. She did not cry in public. She did not ask to see the remains. She did not ask for personal belongings. She only asked that no photos of the ruined house be published. By the next day, she had contacted her insurer to begin the insurance claim process. Detective Delaney watched all this cautiously. He knew that grief manifested itself in unpredictable ways. He was not judging by the lack of tears, but the set of decisions, the timing of her moving away from the house, the denial of the relationship with Josh, the quick access to insurance, the contradiction in her timing was not easy to ignore. Beyond the visible, there was the implicit, the change of identity, the emotional detachment. The Paula who came to that interrogation was not the wife of a dead man. She was someone who had already separated from him long before the fire consumed the mansion. Death had physically sealed something that had already been dissolved for years. For now, there was no concrete evidence. There were no traces of tampering with the gas valve to indicate involvement. Access to the basement where the epicenter of the explosion was found had been blocked by a pile of building materials days earlier. But there was an opportunity. Paula had keys to every room. She knew every space in the house. And according to the remodeling plans, she had personally approved the installation of the new gas system just 2 weeks ago. It was not ruled out, nor was she charged. Her nervousness was real. So was her resentment. In the interrogation room, she left a faint, almost imperceptible scent, but one that felt out of place, like someone who didn't know whether to prepare for a dinner party or a trial. When he left, he did so without greeting. He only stopped to adjust his coat. He walked without looking back. He didn't ask for updates on the investigation. He didn't ask about Carla. He didn't mention Josh, as if everything he needed to know he already knew. Josh Mendez. He was subpoenaed the day after footage from the gym's parking lot was analyzed. The footage showed him with Paula Hartley, standing next to his truck at 2 a.m. The footage showed him and Paula Hartley standing next to his truck at 2 a.m. They were talking in close proximity without intermittency. He was holding her arm. Then she rested her head on his shoulder. 1 kiss, 2, then a long hug. Neither of them looked around. Josh Mendez entered the interrogation room with a firm step, a straight back and still hands. He wore a work jacket with his company logo, a clean-shaven face, and a faint smell of freshly cut wood. He greeted without words, only with a slight nod of his head. He sat down without asking. Detective Delaney placed the printouts of the recordings on the table, a sequence of images arranged by time. Josh looked at the sheets calmly. He made no attempt to explain. He showed no surprise. He just pushed the images aside, like someone pushing away something obvious. He asked no questions. Silently, Delaney unfolded a report dated 5 years ago, a sheet of military letterhead. Josh glanced at it out of the corner of his eye. Then he returned his gaze to the center of the table. His pupils did not dilate, nor did he avert his gaze. Fingers, however, began to gently tap his thigh, a short, repetitive rhythm that didn't stop for several minutes. The report contained his background as a logistics operations technician, specialty, camp structures, perimeter security, and basic explosives handling. A background that in the civilian field translated into electricity, sensitive installations, and knowledge of pressurized gases. The rhythm of the finger changed as the minutes passed. It became more erratic. A brief, slow flicker. A sigh through the nose, then it stopped. He crossed his arms. He made no comment on the report, nor did he deny its contents. He remained static. The authorities showed a simple schematic of the gas mains in the Hartley mansion, a copy of the remodeling plans with annotations made by Paula. A red circle indicated the exact spot where the valve had been tampered with, right in a section under the floor that had been tapped by his team. Josh didn't look at the circle. He looked at the plan as if he knew it by heart. No gesture, no flicker. A new envelope was opened. It contained a screenshot, a search performed from his device 2 weeks earlier. Pressure sensors in household plumbing. Another, more recent, unobtrusive ways to release gas without visible leakage. The images were placed in front of him. He did not touch them, nor did he remove them. Delaney did not speak. The interrogation proceeded without questions, only with evidence laid out as pieces. Josh kept his gaze down, his jaw tense. At one point, he rested both elbows on the table, interlocked his fingers, and stood still. Slow breathing, absolute restraint. He denied nothing. He confirmed nothing. Every gesture was exact, as if his body had rehearsed neutrality. When he finished, he stood up alone when he was beckoned, He pursed his lips. He didn't ask about Paula. He did not ask about the case. He left with the same stride with which he had entered. Cameras in the hallway caught him walking away without looking back, hands in his pockets, back just as straight, head barely tilted down. When all the pieces were on the table, there was no reasonable doubt. The physical evidence, the lab analysis, the behavioral pattern, and the technical profile of the suspect all converged on one name. Josh Mendez was the only one with the ability, access, and motivation necessary to carry out the crime. Detective Ephraim Delaney requested a new subpoena, this time with a clear strategy, no beating around the bush. During the previous weeks, Delaney had replicated on his own, in a secure space within the police department, the components found at the blast site. He studied the charred fragments. He analyzed the soot pattern on the walls. He compared the yellowish residue on the metal disc with various household materials. He came to a clear conclusion. The bomb was not designed to look professional. It was built to look like an accident. He used a canning jar, corn flour, a little water, and a small metal disc. He simulated the environment with an open gas valve and a delayed spark by expanding the contents inside the jar. The system was crude but effective. When the wet corn expanded due to thermal action, it pushed the metal disc, which closed a small circuit with two bare wires, generating the spark needed for ignition. A simple mechanism, almost domestic, ideal to go unnoticed. That was the element that closed the case, the intent behind the design. It wasn't just to kill. It was to do it in a way that looked accidental. Something that could be mistaken for a leak, an electrical spark, a deadly oversight. Coroner's reports indicated that Don Hartley did not die from fire or gas inhalation. The official cause was severe head trauma, single blow, blunt force trauma. The angle of the wound, the depth, and the shape of the impact suggested that he was attacked from behind. He fell without reacting. He died before the device was activated. On further inspection, investigators found a broken flashlight near the point of impact. Its metal structure showed a deformation compatible with the injury to the victim's skull. On its surface, a small dark stain, invisible to the naked eye, was still present. Tests confirmed that it was Don Hartley's blood. Josh Mendez was summoned again. This time, he didn't show the same poise. He entered the room with tense shoulders. He didn't look at the detective. He didn't touch the documents. He didn't ask for explanations. Delaney showed no further evidence. He did not read charges. He just left on the table a small transparent box. Inside, the replicated canning jar, sealed, with its contents visible, wet corn flour, a metal disc, two wires, the faint smell of rust. Mendez did not ask what it was. He did not ask to see more. He remained silent for several minutes. Then he lowered his head. He acknowledged that he had planned it alone, that Paula didn't know anything. He said he didn't need her approval, that he was doing it for her because he saw her trapped, because he heard her crying when she thought no one could hear her, because he couldn't stand to see her go back to that house every night with an empty stare. He confessed that he hit Don in the back, that he waited in the basement until he came down routinely as he always did. He attacked him silently. He fell instantly. There was no screaming. There was no fight. He then placed the flask on a shelf, connected the wires, opened the gas valve, and walked out the back door. He estimated that the internal heat would take effect in about 40 minutes. He had tested the system before. He knew how much time he had to get away. When the canister reached just the right pressure, the disc would make contact, and the spark would ignite the accumulated gas. I wanted it to look like a domestic tragedy. A gas leak, a mistake, a misfortune in an old house. She wanted to erase all intention. She wanted no one to blame her, not her nor him. He said he did not do it out of hatred, that he wasn't seeking revenge, that he just wanted to start over. With Paula, unburdened, no obstacles. Delaney listened without moving. Every word was recorded, every pause noted. There was no resistance to arrest. There were no conditions. Josh Mendez was charged with premeditated murder and use of explosive device with lethal result. He was escorted from the building without resistance. He did not mention Paula again. He showed no remorse. The investigation into Paula Hartley's possible complicity continued for weeks. She was questioned again, but no direct evidence was found to prove her involvement in the planning. There were no messages, calls, or traces of prior knowledge. She was not arrested. The case was closed with a single perpetrator, a plan executed in silence, a death disguised as an accident, a crime born not of hate but of a distorted vision of love. The trial against Josh Mendez was brief. He pleaded guilty at the first formal hearing, which avoided the jury trial phase. The evidence against him was compelling: the voluntary confession, forensic analysis of the body, accurate reconstruction of the device, and confirmation that Don Hartley died before the explosion. The defense raised no substantial objections. It did not attempt to allege insanity or emotional duress. Josh asked only that Paula Hartley not be called to testify. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The sentence was read in an almost empty courtroom. Only 2 reporters were present. Josh listened without altering his gesture. He did not react when his full name was mentioned. He did not look up when he heard the word life. Paula Hartley did not attend the trial. She had been questioned several times during the investigation, but was never charged. The prosecution failed to establish a direct link between her and the planning of the crime. There were no messages, recordings, transfers, or any concrete evidence of complicity, only an ambiguous emotional context, suspicions, silences. After the case, Paula sold the dilapidated mansion for a fraction of its original value. She canceled the renovations and disappeared from the public eye. She did not apply for the life insurance payout, at least not right away. According to bank records, he continued to live in Austin, but in a smaller condo under a middle name that did not appear on his usual record. He kept a low profile. He never spoke to the press again. The community fragmented. Some neighbors defended Paula. They said she had been the victim of a caged life. Others pointed to her as morally, though not legally, responsible. No one ever mentioned Don Hartley in social circles again. His name was associated with a tragedy that seemed to go beyond the bounds of a family story. For Detective Delaney, the case was filed with a short note at the end of the file. No clue was left loose. No loose end left untied. Only one sentence he wrote in his personal notebook: "Love misunderstood has more gunpowder than hate." And he closed the report. Without glory, without vengeance, only with truth. And ashes. Case 4. In a western suburb of Denver, where the streets look sleepy even in the daytime, where white picket fences divide identical properties and yards are calculatedly manicured, normalcy broke down shortly before 3 in the morning. A neighbor, a retired veteran and light sleeper, was the first to notice that something wasn't right. The kitchen light in the house next door had been on for hours. Then a scream. Brief, dry, human. He didn't know if it was fear or pain, only that it was not normal. She crossed the street cautiously, saw that the front door was ajar, and called 911 without entering. When the patrol arrived, the scene was clear and disturbing. The interior of the house was tidy, clean, with no signs of forced entry or looting. But in the kitchen, the harmony was brutally broken. In the center of the floor, Clara Simmons, 42, lay face up with a kitchen knife deeply embedded in her chest. There was no sign of prolonged struggle. The cut was direct, lethal. Around the body, fresh blood, a fallen lamp, several shards of glass scattered as if an object had been thrown against the floor or wall. The back window, broken from the inside, let in the cold, early morning air. But there were no traces of entry through it. No footprints, no shifting of the frame, no signs of external climbing. The most disconcerting element was not the gun, nor the blood, nor the broken window. It was the photograph. A framed family picture, torn in two, soaked in blood and placed just inches from the body. It didn't look like a fall. It did not look like an accident. Its position suggested symbolic intent. When Detective Leland Shaw arrived, the scene was already secured. He did not hurry. He walked slowly, his coat closed to his collar, gloves on, and an expression that revealed neither haste nor excitement. He studied the perimeter without speaking. He stopped in front of the broken window, then at the photo, then at the still frozen face of Clara Simmons, whose expression was not one of surprise, but of recognition. As if she had known, seconds before she died, who was standing in front of her. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no stolen items. There were no cameras at the entrance, but there were motion sensors completely disconnected. The door lock was not forced. The security chain was still hanging, unused. The motive was not immediate, no robbery, no apparent revenge, but hatred needs no witnesses, only opportunity. And the scene, carefully brutalized, spoke of an intimate impulse, of someone who knew her, who crossed the threshold without violence, who left a familiar image torn as a message, not an accident. For Leland Shaw, there was no doubt. The killer had been there more than once. He was no stranger. And that torn, blood-soaked photo didn't point to a random crime. It pointed to a private history buried under years of domestic routine. A story that night, had finally gone out to kill. In the days following the crime, the image of Clara Elizabeth Simmons began to be reconstructed from different angles. In the community, her name aroused immediate affection. An occupational therapist with nearly 20 years of experience, she had worked with patients of all ages, in hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and private practices. She was known for her patience, her ability for emotional companionship, and a seemingly inexhaustible empathy. Her face was familiar at neighborhood events, health fairs, and school activities. But beneath that harmonious surface, her private life was more complex. She was married to Peter Simmons, a civil engineer, with whom she shared the house where she was murdered. The marriage had been described by those close to her as stable, although not particularly affectionate. No scandals, no public conflicts, but no visible signs of closeness either. A bond that seemed functional rather than emotional. The most difficult dimension to explore was her relationship with her adopted son, 17-year-old Jonah Simmons, adopted at 11 from a broken foster care system, with a history of childhood trauma and disruptive behaviors that had never fully resolved. Several school reports noted episodes of isolation, conflicts with educational authorities, and frequent mood swings. Some teachers described him as bright but unapproachable. Others simply described him as a boy who drags something down. The relationship between Clara and Jonah was not easy. She defended him in public, attended his school meetings, and spoke of him with a mixture of pride and concern. But the therapeutic attendance records showed a different reality. 3 attempts at family intervention in the past 2 years, one of which had ended abruptly when Jonah refused to continue attending. The clinical history also included psychological evaluations for impulsivity, repressed hostility, and severe difficulties in establishing secure attachments. That tension was not secret, but neither was it openly spoken. It was part of the family's functional silence. In the neighborhood, Jonah was seen as aloof, polite but cold, reserved to the point of disdain. On the night of the crime, according to his own testimony, he was not at home. He claimed to have spent the night at a friend's house but gave no details. His cell phone was turned off for several hours, and the neighborhood security cameras did not capture his return to the house. Technical analysis revealed that the motion sensors had been manually deactivated between 0043 and 0206, an exact window that coincided with the estimated time window of the murder. The relationship with the father, Peter, was equally distant. He worked long hours away from home and had recently traveled for work. He was scheduled to return the following week. That made Clara the only adult present in the home the night of the murder. Nothing was missing from the house. No valuables were missing. There were no traces of strangers, just that torn family photograph placed with a precision that spoke not of chaos or escape, but of emotional intent, a photograph where Jonah appeared in the center. To Detective Leland Shaw, that image, soaked in blood, was more telling than any print. It didn't point to an impulsive crime. It pointed to an open wound, and to a house where love, despite best efforts, had never quite arrived. The first name to emerge in the investigation was the most obvious: Peter Simmons, husband of the victim, and the visible head of a family that, at least from the outside, seemed functional. He was the absent but constant figure, the one who paid the bills, the one who appeared in birthday photos with the right smile and body turned slightly outward. A senior executive at a Denver-based software firm, Peter spent much of his time on business trips, hotels, airports, shared offices. His schedule was as structured as his speech. Clara described him as efficient, predictable, and practical, and also as emotionally distant. At the time of the crime, Peter was in Seattle, participating in an investor round for a new product line. His name soon appeared in the initial reports, not as an active suspect, but as a presence to be formally ruled out. The protocol was clear. The spouse is always the first circle to be questioned, especially when the scene suggests something more personal than circumstantial. His return was quick and quiet. He took the first available flight and landed in Denver shortly before dawn. By 10 in the morning, he was in the interview room. He carried a black folder with neatly organized documents: hotel reservations, digital access logs, meal invoices, flight itineraries, and time-stamped emails. Each piece of paper was accompanied by a digital version on his phone. He didn't look distressed, nor cold, just practical, as if he understood that the best way to protect himself was transparency. Peter confirmed what the paperwork already suggested. He was out of state from Monday until Thursday night. The crime occurred early Wednesday morning. His face was captured by hotel security cameras at different times, and his GPS geolocation matched his recorded movements. Several witnesses corroborated his presence: colleagues, associates, event attendees. There were no contradictions. His alibi was solid, but the usefulness of his presence was not limited to verifying her innocence. It also offered an intimate angle for understanding Clara. Their relationship, in her words, was stable but routine. He used terms like functional, respectful, and harmonious. None of them carried emotional weight. When asked about the last few days before the trip, he answered accurately: quiet dinners, no altercations, a comment about the dishwasher filter. It all sounded ordinary. It all sounded empty. There were no romantic messages in his emails, nor were they hostile. Clara and Peter talked to each other about logistics: shopping, bills, medical reminders for Jonah, nothing more. A dynamic that, for many married couples, could pass for maturity. For Marin, it was more like chronic disconnection. At the mention of Jonah, Peter's expression changed slightly. He looked down. He paused longer before responding. He said the bond was difficult, that he never quite managed to get close, that the boy was smart but secretive, that Clara was overly protective of him, that he honestly felt out of the picture, as if the house ran itself, without him. There were no complaints, there were no accusations, only resignation, a kind of abandonment that is not physical, but that seeps into the cracks of the everyday. Shaw took note of each response, not out of suspicion but for context. Peter Simmons had not killed his wife. He wasn't there. He didn't touch the gun, he didn't manipulate the scene. But his distance, his absence, his way of living with the minimum offered an important emotional clue. The house had been fragmented since before the knife entered Clara's chest. What looked like harmony was, in reality, neutrality. At the end of the interrogation, Peter asked if he could retrieve some personal items. He did not ask about the torn family photograph, nor about the details of the find. He did not ask to enter the house. He just left his contact card and left quietly. He got into a rental car, as efficiently as he had sorted through his papers. He was ruled out as a suspect. But in Marin's notebook there was a brief line written next to his name. Not all crimes leave culprits. Some only leave absences. The second to be questioned was Jonah Simmons, Clara's adopted son. He was 17 years old, but his presence cast a heavier shadow than his age suggested. Tall, thin, with restrained movements and a gaze that glided across surfaces without anchoring on any one point. He arrived accompanied by a social worker. He did not speak on the way. He did not greet. He asked no questions. He sat, hunched forward, arms folded across his chest, chin almost sunken. It was inevitable. The fact that he lived in the same house where the murder was committed placed him at the center of the investigation. His testimony was fundamental to reconstruct the timeline, also to understand the hidden dynamics of that family. Jonah's history was marked by a set of diagnoses that read like silent warnings: complex childhood trauma, adjustment disorder, behavioral isolation, and documented episodes of intense emotional dysregulation. He had been adopted by Clara and Peter at age 11 after going through 3 foster homes and 2 institutions. Since then, his school performance fluctuated between academic genius and emotional withdrawal. He had no criminal record, but did have records of conflicts with authority figures, suspensions for threatening language, and therapy sessions abandoned without closure. When questioned about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, Jonah claimed to have been out walking alone from 9:30 p.m. until after midnight. He said he needed air, that the house seemed oppressive when his father was gone. He did not mention anyone he had crossed paths with. He did not specify a clear route. There were no cameras in nearby parks, no witnesses, no records of movement on her phone. His alibi was weak, practically non-existent. During cross-examination, Detective Shaw displayed several photographs of the crime scene. Some were broad, contextual, others were more direct. In one, Clara's body was partially covered, but with one breast exposed, the result of the impact and the fall. The image, though technical, had an emotional effect. Jonah blushed at the sight of it. He averted his gaze. He inhaled sharply through his nose. The discomfort was evident, a kind of embarrassment born not of pain but of something more ambiguous. Shaw noted it. He didn't underestimate it. In his body language there was something that did not match. His answers were short but not evasive. He kept a constant tension in his shoulders, as if waiting for a blow that never came. At times he seemed absent, as if observing the scene from a distant place. At other times he clung to the edge of the chair, as if he had to consciously remind himself that he was there. She did not cry. He didn't ask for details. He didn't want to know how his mother had died. When asked about his relationship with Clara, he said it was complicated, that they argued, that she wanted to help him, but he didn't want to be helped. He said she smothered him with her soft voice, with her corrections, with that way of looking that mixed pity with demand. He admitted that sometimes he thought about leaving, that he fantasized about escaping, but that he had nowhere to go. In school reports, psychologists had described his bond with Clara as ambivalent and fraught with unspoken resentment. Jonah had never been violent with her. He never raised his voice to her, but neither did he get close. He avoided physical contact, deep conversations, shared routines. She still treated him like a vulnerable child. He, like an uncomfortable presence. The record of motion sensors in the house revealed an important piece of information. They were manually deactivated during a time slot that coincided with his alleged nighttime walk. There was no reason to do so if he wasn't going to be home. There was no logical explanation. Jonah said maybe he did it without thinking, that he didn't remember, that maybe he just wanted the house to be quiet. No direct physical evidence linking him to the murder was found. There was no blood on his clothing, no fingerprints on the weapon, no visible injuries. Only a weak alibi, a disturbing reaction to the body image, and an unstable emotional presence. For Shaw, it wasn't enough to charge him, but it was enough to take a closer look at him. He was the only one who had nowhere to hide, the only one who couldn't say he wasn't there. And in that house, where the crime left no witnesses, the silence of a son could weigh as much as the blood on the floor. Amanda Keller's name came up in the second round of interviews, when Clara's personal and professional circle began to unfold in more detail. She was in her 30s and worked as a clinical psychologist at the same center, where Clara practiced as an occupational therapist. Her professional background was impeccable, but her bond with the victim went far beyond the work. Amanda was not just another colleague. She was an avowed admirer. Over the years, she had quoted Clara in professional publications, accompanied her to workshops and lectures, and on more than one occasion described her as her model of therapeutic integrity. For many in the clinic, that admiration had fuzzy edges, a certain emotional intensity that did not quite fit into a professional working environment. Clara, according to internal reports, had begun to distance herself in recent months, first with subtle cuts in informal meetings, then with a progressive assignment of cases to other professionals on the team. That aloofness did not go unnoticed. Amanda noticed it. She interpreted it. She felt it as a veiled betrayal. She didn't verbalize it, but it was conveyed in the way she asked about Clara, in the insistence that she wanted to participate in her activities, in the emails that, although correct, carried a tone of covert pleading. Clara, it seemed, had stopped answering many of them. When Amanda was summoned to testify, her attitude was cooperative but nervous. Her language was structured, clinical, too elaborate for the spontaneity expected in a testimony. She dressed soberly, but her makeup was corrected several times. In the folder of documents she carried, papers of no relevance stood out. Printed notes from old emails, underlined texts of articles written by Clara, phrases marked in pencil. At first glance, they looked like preparation, but they also pointed to a form of unresolved attachment. He said that he had had no contact with Clara in the last 5 days, that he had noticed her distant, that he attributed it to stress, that he understood her. But he also slipped in a phrase that caught Detective Shaw's attention. Some people think they can withdraw from a deep connection like turning off a lamp. But not every link is severed without leaving residual electricity, Shaw noted. Not for what he said, but because of how he said it. In reviewing her alibi, the technology was clear. Amanda had been on a professional video call between 2:02 a.m. and 3:04 a.m., the same time frame in which the murder was committed. The call was with a colleague in another city, with whom she was preparing a presentation for a conference. The footage was automatically saved to the cloud. The image was clear. The conversation was steady. His alibi was solid. There was no displacement. There were no signs of time manipulation, nor physical evidence linking her to the crime scene. But her behavior in the interrogation, although not guilty, did leave a trail of emotional imbalance. In her psychological profile, Amanda showed traits of affective dependence and extreme interpersonal idealization, especially towards authority figures who offered her emotional validation. Clara had been that figure, and her progressive withdrawal had left a void that Amanda did not know how to interpret as part of a professional process but as personal abandonment. There was no logical motive, but there was an emotional state prone to rupture if the rejection was perceived with sufficient intensity. Shaw did not see Amanda as a murderer, but she was a symbolic presence of the pain that can be caused by a figure that becomes a mirror. For Amanda, Clara was not just a mentor, she was a structure, and that structure, by withdrawing, had left her without sustenance. Before leaving, Amanda handed over a printed note. It was a piece of mail she never sent. It was addressed to Clara. In it, she told her that she understood, that she forgave her silence, that if she ever decided to talk, she would be there. The letter had no rancor, nor was it a farewell, just an emotional echo that, although it did not kill, continued to vibrate in the empty walls of a one-sided relationship. Melanie Parker had been, for years, the closest name to Clara Simmons. Friends, colleagues, and confidants, they had shared not only workspace, but also coffees at the end of shifts, shared candlelight birthdays, and messages that began with, "I need to get something off my chest." In the clinic environment, their bond was known and even envied by some. They had a common language, a discreet complicity. But in recent months, something had broken. When the investigators began to look into Clara's social environment, the name Melanie came up naturally, not because of direct suspicion, but because of historical proximity. It was inevitable. The people closest to a victim are always examined, even if only to rule them out. Melanie was 32 years old. She was also an occupational therapist with a less visible profile than Clara, but just as committed. For years, Clara had been her reference, but also her equal. They shared patients, treatment strategies, and even ways of looking at life. Or so it seemed. Until distance settled in, subtle and persistent. There were no arguments, no declared ruptures, just a silent withdrawal, first emotionally, then professionally. The message logs between the two evidenced this. Clara stopped responding quickly. Invitations began to space out. Conversations stopped having emotional content. Melanie would ask, "Everything okay between us?" Clara would answer with polite evasions, "Nothing more." During the week of the murder, Melanie was in Seattle, participating in a professional conference on neurorehabilitation. The event had been planned months in advance, and her presence there was fully verified. Admission records, messages with other colleagues, hotel security footage, and her participation as a speaker all ruled out any possibility of a physical link to the crime. Even so, she was summoned to testify, by protocol, and because of what her language could reveal. Melanie showed up with a pale face, dry lips, and trembling hands. Not from guilt, but from something more difficult to classify: emotional disorientation. She didn't fully understand the place she now occupied. From best friend to interrogation, from confidant to part of a murder investigation. He said that his relationship with Clara had changed without explanation, that he felt it first in the details, the way she was slow to respond, the way she avoided personal issues. Then came the drift away and work dynamics. Clara began to bond more with other colleagues, especially Amanda Keller, which gave Melanie an uneasiness that was hard to put into words. Not romantic jealousy, but a form of affective displacement, of abandonment without closure. In the interrogation, her voice remained steady, but there were pauses in the sentences, moments when his eyes filled with something short of tears. He said he didn't understand why Clara walked away, that they never talked about it, that it just stopped being a priority for her one day. He did not deny having felt anger nor sadness. She admitted to having thought that something had been broken between them forever, but she also said there was no resentment, only mourning, that Clara was a formative presence in her life, and that her estrangement left her lost, not angry. In her digital records, there was nothing linking her to the crime. No hostile messages, no suspicious searches, no physical movement out of the ordinary. Her stay in Seattle was legitimate and corroborated. Her alibi was proven and robust. For Detective Shaw, what was interesting was not the possibility that he had killed. What was interesting was how a friendship can become a bloodless wound, how closeness can become a grievance when it becomes distance for no reason, and how sometimes in that empty space something like resentment germinates, even if it doesn't lead to action. Melanie was formally ruled out as a suspect. She was informed respectfully, but also with the clarity the case demanded. Before leaving, she asked if she could stop by the house, just to pick up a scarf she had given Clara as a winter gift. He was told no. He left without insisting, without looking back. But his place in history was recorded not for what he did, but for what he once was, a daily presence that, when it disappeared, left more shadow than light. The closure of the case did not come with physical evidence or an unexpected witness. It came with a key and a locked door from the inside. It came during a second authorized search of Jonah Simmons' room, requested by Detective Leland Shaw after detecting emotional and temporal inconsistencies in his statements. What they found there needed no interpretation, only reading. Hidden behind the bottom drawer of his desk, covered by a thin layer of adhesive paper, were several envelopes containing handwritten letters, printed photographs, and a worn notebook. The letters, addressed to Clara, were never sent. In them, Jonah wrote of his confusion, his desire to be close, his frustration at what he called the maternal silence that kept him away. The texts were not direct threats, but they conveyed an eagerness for possession. Words like mine, destined, you stay away because you are afraid of what we are, were repeated frequently. The photographs were more disturbing. Images taken from the crack of a door, from the bathroom hallway, from the garden window. In all of them, Clara appeared alone, doing household activities or getting ready for bed. Some were printed on photographic paper. Others were enlarged with annotations on the back. Next to these, a small box contained carefully folded women's underwear, identified as belonging to Clara by the house inventory. It had been taken without her knowledge. The diary was the most revealing, pages filled with obsessive thoughts, strokes alternating between neat letters and chaotic bursts. In his entries, Jonah fantasized about being the man of the house, about taking the place Peter had left empty. He referred to Clara not as a mother, but as the central figure of an unresolved emotional need. The line between love, dependence, and desire was completely distorted. In one of the last pages, dated only 3 days before the murder, he wrote, "When she rejects me, I feel like I disappear. I can't be invisible. I can't not be in her life. If she doesn't see me, I'm not real. If she doesn't accept me, she has to stop breathing." When confronted with the material, Jonah made no attempt to deny it. Nor did he appear upset. He looked at it all in silence. He did not ask for a lawyer. He didn't cry. He just mumbled that it was the only way the noise would stop. Then he confessed. He said that the night of the crime he had been spying on Clara from the hallway, that he watched her while she was making tea alone in the kitchen, that he approached her unnoticed, that he confronted her. He did not say precisely, but subsequent reconstruction established that he attempted an inappropriate physical contact, an innuendo disguised as emotional closeness. Clara rejected him. She pushed him away. She called him by name, not with hatred, but with firmness. That gesture, that boundary, was the spark. In a flurry, Jonah grabbed the first blunt object within reach, a thick-handled kitchen knife. He held it in both hands and plunged it into Clara's chest with enough force to pierce her collarbone. The impact was direct. Clara fell almost instantly. The blow dragged with it a wall lamp, which crashed to the floor. At that moment, Jonah smashed the window from the inside in a clumsy attempt to simulate a forced entry. But he did not flee. He stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes. He looked at the body. Then he took the family photograph from the dining room frame, tore it in two, and carefully placed it next to Clara. The gesture was not accidental. It was a symbolic statement, a way to erase Peter. Of defacing the family structure, he felt alien. In his mind, they were no longer mother and son. They were Clara and Jonah alone, no more witnesses. He walked out the front door. He left everything on. He walked for more than an hour aimlessly, then quietly returned through the back of the neighborhood. He showered. He hid the evidence and turned off his phone until the next morning. During the trial, the court had full access to the diary, the letters, and the taped confession. The defense attempted to claim severe mental disorder, but the forensic team determined that although Jonah was emotionally disturbed, he was fully aware of his actions. His ability to plan, conceal evidence, and feign an alibi ruled out unimpeachability. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was 17 years old at the time of the crime, but the court decided to try him as an adult, considering the seriousness of the act, the psychological profile, and the symbolic nature of the murder. During sentencing, he showed no remorse, just an empty expression, as if his inner reality had been extinguished along with the life he tried to possess. In Detective Shaw's notebook, the case was closed with a brief note. It read, "He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to stop the pain of being invisible. And he chose the most irreversible way to exist forever in her memory, to become her end."